you and the ranking member. I appreciate you holding this hearing on a very important topic. Deputy Assistant Secretary O'Reilly, the pandemic exposed many of the region's weaknesses, including widening social inequalities, widespread informality, growing environmental risks, a gender-based violence epidemic, and weak healthcare and education institutions. When you pair that with massive population displacement and efforts by certain leaders to systematically dismantle democratic institutions, I'm concerned that the next decade in the hemisphere will be a turbulent one, unless the United States, the international communities, and our partners in the region are strategic in addressing these increasingly complex challenges. Now, from my own perspective, the administration's vaccine diplomacy and policy in the Western Hemisphere has been a failure. Let me give you an example. I was talking to a president in the hemisphere, and he said to me, I am pro-American. But in the midst of the pandemic, I wanted to buy. I wasn't even looking for donations of vaccines. I wanted to buy vaccines for my people. I couldn't get anywhere with the U.S. government. China sold them the vaccines. Maybe less efficient, but if you've got nothing, then you'll take something at the end of the day. I am privatizing for the first time our energy infrastructure. Try to get America interested in the possibilities. China comes along and says, we'll buy the bonds. We're having challenges with the IMF, which is a problem that is beyond this country that I'm referring to. It's hemispheric. Because look at what we did as a government to ultimately deal with the economic challenges of the pandemic, how much money we pumped into the economy and to help families. But not every country has that wherewithal. And yet the IMF is creating a series of conditions that they insist without creating a smoothing period so that these countries can get through this difficult time and the economic consequences of the COVID pandemic. So the Chinese come to this president and say, okay, we lend to you at 1%. Now, we missed the boat on vaccines in the Western Hemisphere. And all of us wrote to you meaning the administration, urging you to do take a much different course. You can have all the calculuses you want. I can create the little boxes and checks to say that we systematically did it this way. But the reality is, in our own hemisphere, in our own front yard, with all of the nexus of family and trade and migration, in our own interests, forget about being a good neighbor, in our own interests, it made eminent sense to significantly deploy the vaccine in the hemisphere. We failed. China was in there, they got the goodwill, and we failed. So now the question is, how do we deal with the aftermath of that failure in the context of the economic challenges that are facing these countries? So can you tell us how you're working with the Treasury Department to ensure that the United States uses its voice and its vote at the IMF and the World Bank to ensure greater flexibility and increase access to resources for these developing countries as they pursue their post-COVID-19 recovery?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. I mean, one of the things that the administration is doing is working with other members of the International Monetary Fund to develop the Resilience and Sustainability Trust over at the IMF, and seeking also additional or authorization to lend $21 billion to poor and low-income countries, and putting a focus particularly on areas which have been really walloped by this first year and a half to 2 years of the pandemic, small islands economies. And there's a particular focus in doing so on the Caribbean. And And I think that's going to be one significant process underway. We also work very closely with the Inter-American Development Bank. I also have responsibilities for preparing for the Summit of the Americas next year. And we have a process underway of reviewing, I know, keen interest that you and other members of this committee have in the future of our...
Mr. Chairman, if I may, so I appreciate all of that, but here's the point. Mm-hmm. If we do not use our voice and our vote at the IMF and the World Bank, you will see more of what you saw in Colombia. Colombia is being squeezed by the IMF. The Duque administration responded by doing a series of fiscal issues that the IMF wanted to see, and there was social unrest. If you do not, I'm not talking about people walking away from their obligations. I'm talking about creating a smoothing period so that they can get through what we are getting through as a country, but they do not have the wherewithal to get through as a country, so that, in fact, they can then meet their obligations. If we don't do that, we're going to see enormous social unrest. And we might as well turn the hemisphere over to authoritarian figures, because they will say the way to solve your problems is not through this democratic process, but through authoritarianism, which is unfortunately rampant. And I'm glad you raised the IDB as the last point I'll make. All of us here have been advocating for a capital increase for the Inter-American Development Bank as part of the U.S. effort to support the region's economic recovery. And I thought this administration would embrace our bipartisan effort to do exactly that, because if you want to deal with China in terms of its pervasive presence in the hemisphere, you create the wherewithal to meet the challenge of what they are doing in the hemisphere by an institution like the IDB and by the DFC and others. At the end of the day, why is it that the administration has not embraced a 10th capital increase?
My understanding, Senator, is that the issue remains under review, and we certainly have had discussions about this with our colleagues of the Treasury Department, and we do recognize the absolutely essential role that the Inter-American Development Bank plays in this hemisphere, and that it needs to be able to act in the most robust way possible within its authority.
Well, while we are navel-gazing about this issue, it seems to me it's rather straightforward. China is displacing our influence in the region, and we have no tools to effectively deal with that. So maybe we can stop looking at our navel, figure out how we are going to support an increase and under what conditions, and then get the IDB with the U.S. representative there to start engaging in the hemisphere in a way that can turn the dynamics around. Because I'm telling you, as someone who has spent 30 years in not only in foreign affairs, but most specifically focused on the hemisphere, we are losing and losing fast. This is not just this administration, but nonetheless, it is this administration that has the power to change it, and it should. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Second round of questions.